In the 1920s, the richest people on Earth, per person, weren't living in New York or London or Paris. They lived on a stretch of rocky prairie in northern Oklahoma that the government had written off as worthless. Nobody could farm it, and nobody wanted it, which, at the time, was exactly the point. But underneath that ground sat one of the largest oil deposits in the country, and the people who owned it, the Osage Nation, were about to become wealthier than almost anyone alive. And then, one by one, they started turning up dead. The Osage owned that oil outright. Every drop of it under the entire reservation belonged to the tribe. And that came down to a decision they'd made decades earlier that nobody saw coming. When the government forced the Osage off their original territory in Kansas, they used their own money to buy their new reservation. This rugged, stony corner of Oklahoma that white settlers had already ridden through and rejected. And because they bought the land, they owned everything under it too. When oil was struck under that reservation in the late 1890s, the weight of that decision became almost impossible to measure. And then the tribe made one more move that changed everything. In 1906, when the government finally carved the surface of the land into individual plots, the Osage refused to give up what was below it. They kept the oil, the gas, every mineral under the whole reservation, owned collectively by the tribe, and they got it written into federal law. That collective ownership was split into shares. They called them headrights. Every Osage on the tribal rolls at the time, 2,229 people, got exactly one. A headright wasn't a plot of land you could stand on. It was a slice of every dollar of oil money the whole reservation produced, paid to you in cash 4 times a year. No one could buy a headright and no one could sell one. They passed down through the family, from parents to children. And as the wells came in, those quarterly checks turned into something the world had genuinely never seen before. By the 1910s, wooden oil derricks covered the hills of Osage County, and it had become one of the most productive oil fields on the planet. The Burbank field alone pumped more than 100 million barrels of oil in a single year. Buyers came from all over the country to bid for the right to drill, gathering under one big tree outside the town of Pawhuska that people started calling the $1 Million Elm, because that's roughly what the leases went for. One 160-acre tract sold for nearly $2 million. For the right to drill on a patch of grass smaller than a golf course. And the money reached the people who owned it. In 1923, oil leases paid the Osage more than $30 million. In today's money, that's over $400 million in a single year, split between a few thousand people. By 1926, the average Osage family of 5 was bringing in more than $65,000 a year, at a time when most Americans lived on a few hundred. So they built mansions out on the prairie. They bought new cars, sometimes 3 or 4 at a time, and hired drivers to take them around. They sent their kids to boarding schools back east and staffed their homes with servants. Newspapers across America ran astonished and often ugly stories about the Osage and their oil fortune, but that kind of money never sits quietly for long. When a few thousand people are suddenly sitting on that kind of fortune, the people who want a piece of it come looking. And the men who came looking for the Osage weren't going to ask. So how do you take a fortune from people the law says own it? The first way was completely legal. In 1921, Congress passed a law aimed squarely at the Osage. It decided that many of them, especially those who were half or more Osage by blood, simply couldn't be trusted to handle their own money. So the courts assigned them guardians, white guardians, local lawyers, bankers, and businessmen put in charge of the oil money of grown adults whose only supposed failing was being born Osage. The guardians were supposed to protect the people they were assigned to. Instead, plenty of them just robbed their wards. A guardian could decide how much of your own money you were allowed to spend in a week. Some of the richest people in the country had to ask a white banker's permission to buy ordinary things. while their guardians quietly skimmed the accounts and steered whole fortunes into their own pockets. And for some of these men, even that wasn't fast enough, because there was one other way to get a headright. If the person holding it died, the money passed to whoever was next in line. To see how dark this got, you only have to follow one family. Her name was Molly Burkhart. She was full-blooded Osage. She had a mother, 3 sisters, a family she loved, and a headright, and so did every one of them. And in the early 1920s, the people in Molly's family started dying, one after another. It started with her sister, Anna Brown. Anna went missing in the spring of 1921, and about a week later, her body turned up in a ravine, a bullet in the back of her head. The local authorities barely looked into it, and Anna was only the first. A few months later, Molly's mother, Lizzie, died of what was quietly called an illness, though the family was certain she'd been poisoned. Then Molly's cousin, Henry Roan, was found shot dead in his car. The bodies were stacking up, and every single one of them had a headright. If you're the kind of person who likes the story buried underneath the famous one, take a second and subscribe. We go digging up forgotten places like this every week, but stay with this one because the worst of it was still to come. In March of 1923, it came. In the middle of the night, an explosion tore the home of Molly's sister, Rita, and her husband, Bill Smith, right off its foundation. Someone had planted a charge of nitroglycerin underneath the house. Rita was killed instantly. So was a 17-year-old girl staying with them that night, a servant named Nettie Brookshire. Bill was pulled out of the rubble alive, barely, and lived just long enough to name the 2 men he was certain were behind it. By now, Molly was watching her entire family disappear, and she herself had started to feel sick, weak, and fading, and no doctor could tell her why. And the Burkharts weren't the only Osage family being wiped out. Across the county, the body count kept climbing, and anyone who got close to the truth had a way of dying too. An attorney who'd gathered evidence about the killings was thrown from a moving train. Another man who knew too much died in a car wreck that looked staged. Local police, local courts, even local doctors, most of them looked the other way. Some of them were in on it. But the men behind the killings had finally gotten greedy enough that Washington noticed. By the mid-1920s, the Osage had spent years begging for help and being ignored. Finally, the case landed on the desk of a young, ambitious official named J. Edgar Hoover, who was running what was then called the Bureau of Investigation, the agency that would soon become the FBI. For a brand new bureau desperate to prove it mattered, this was the case to crack. Hoover put a former Texas Ranger named Tom White in charge. White sent agents into Osage County undercover, posing as cattlemen and insurance salesmen, quietly pulling apart financial records and chasing down witnesses who kept turning up dead. And slowly the trail led back to one man almost nobody suspected. His name was William Hale. He was one of the most powerful and respected men in the entire county, a wealthy cattle rancher who called himself the King of the Osage Hills. He'd funded schools and hospitals for the Osage. He called himself their friend. He'd even stood at Anna's funeral and promised her family he'd find who did it. And he was the uncle of Ernest Burkhart, the white man married to Molly. Hale had built the whole thing. Years earlier, he'd pushed his own nephew, Ernest, into marrying Molly, and then he began killing off her family, one by one, so that every headright they held would pass down through Ernest and straight into Hale's hands. Which means the man Molly had married, the father of her children, was part of the plot to destroy her family. And the sickness she couldn't explain, the poison working through her month after month, was almost certainly part of the same scheme, coming from the people around her, inside her own home. Hale hired the killers. He arranged the bombing. He even collected on a fraudulent life insurance policy after one of the murders he'd ordered. Under the pressure of the investigation, Ernest finally cracked. He confessed and he testified against his own uncle. In the end, Hale was convicted of first-degree murder and sent to Leavenworth Prison. Ernest went to prison too. For the first time, someone had actually been held to account. But justice, if you can even call it that, was thin. The Bureau closed the handful of cases it could pin directly on Hale, and then it walked away. Around 20 other Osage murders were never solved and never seriously investigated. And those are only the ones on record. The official count of the dead sits at roughly 24. Osage historians put it closer to 60. Some believe the real number runs into the hundreds, spread across years of quiet poisonings and staged accidents that nobody ever questioned. The honest answer is that no one will ever know how many Osage were killed for their oil. The wells are still out there. A lone pump still works that same ground today. The Osage still hold their headrights, passed down through the families of the ones who survived, still paying out quarter after quarter 100 years later. And for most of that century, almost no one outside Oklahoma knew any of this had happened. It took a book and then a film to finally drag it back into the light. An entire people became the richest on earth, all because of what was buried under land that nobody else wanted. And then they were hunted for it. If you want another piece of American history that got buried on purpose, the next one's already on screen.